the field of philanthropy today is in an interesting place, and we're going to talk about that. I do encourage you, and I'll say this from the start, to get Phil's book and to read Phil's books. Anybody that's interested in philanthropy, the breadth and depth of what he covers and what we're going to try to talk about tonight, we'll get to only a small part of what he covers in his book. But if you really want to understand the issues in philanthropy today in America, this is the book to read. I say that because there are a number of books out on philanthropy now, and they have different points of view, and I've read all of them, and I've talked to the authors, and I will simply say I think Phil is the one who's got it right. It's fair and it's balanced and it's honest, and he agrees. So we're gonna engage in a conversation, and we don't quite know where it's going to lead. But when we're done talking, we're gonna want to engage you in the conversation, and I think it's really important for you to feel comfortable asking your questions, whatever they are, because I believe that what you ask and what you say in this conversation will help all the rest of us. So help all of us learn by being part of the conversation, and that's what we hope to do. Another point I want to make before we start talking is some of you were here a year ago when we had Anand Gerahardis, who wrote Winners Take All. And we're going to talk about him in that book, and we're going to talk about that perspective about philanthropy today. So we didn't want to just to have Anand here and not have another point of view. And I'm pleased to do this with Lori, for the ACF to do this with Lori, and also our great friends at Virginia Piper Trust, and I see Mary Jane here, the CEO, so thank you, Mary Jane. When we started talking about we ought to have Phil here, she just jumped right on it, so you have a big fan at Piper, as you probably know. So Phil, welcome to Arizona.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Steve, and thanks to Piper Trust, and thanks to the Arizona Grantmakers Forum. Lori and the team here are exceptionally good. I go talk to a lot of regional associations, and I keep telling Kim, nobody is as well organized as she is. So well organized that when she could tell I couldn't figure out how to turn on the microphone, she just brought me one that was on. So thank you. And I do hope you pick up the book, which I think, by virtue of all of these kind folks, is literally there for the taking. So if you don't pick one up, I would be really hurt. Because I don't think you even have to buy it. You can just pick it up. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk with everybody tonight.
So Phil, I think it would be good just to set the stage for you to tell us a little bit about your story and how did you arrive here, and why did philanthropy become such a passion of yours at such a young age, according to Lori. And just give us a sense of your history and what drove you to be focused on philanthropy the way you do.
Sure, thanks. I'm always a little self-conscious about this because I'm a perfectly ordinary guy, you know what I mean? And I grew up in Oregon. I was born in Toronto, Canada. I think to the extent that I got really interested, you know, at a pretty young age in sort of what difference I could make in the world, it was because of my dad, and who was actually kind of like a radical activist, and he literally did things like lay across the train tracks where they were taking nuclear warheads up to Washington State and got arrested. He did, I don't
You'll fit right in Arizona.
well, I'm just telling you, and I came from kind of the classic 70s dysfunctional family. You know, parents split up when I was young, but I spent a lot of time with my dad on the weekends, and I was super inspired by some of what I knew about him, mostly through other people, because he didn't talk about getting arrested at a lunch counter sit-in in North Carolina in the early 60s. But he did do things like tell me when I was 10 years old, I'm not going to see much of you this summer because I'm taking the summer and I'm going to pick fruit with migrant farm workers in, I think it was Central Oregon. And I said, well, why aren't you hanging out with me? You know, and he was like, because I want to understand their lives better. So my dad was a very quirky and very flawed person, but also kind of an exceptional guy. And for any of you, and I'm sure a lot of you did, who lost a parent when you're young, my dad died sort of out of the blue when I was 14. I think I spent a lot of my career trying to figure out, like, what could I do and what would my dad think, you know? And there, somewhere along the way when I was in business school, getting an MBA, I thought, oh, my dad would not be he would not, he would, you know, and I worked in the corporate world as a strategy consultant for a little while, and I felt his judgment. Then I had an opportunity to be involved in establishing the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and it struck me as a great opportunity, because here you have these institutions with vast assets, the opportunity to do a ton of good, and unlike in the business world, it's not super easy to judge what is the best thing to do, or to judge performance. How do you know whether you're making a difference? And so I was attracted to the idea that CEP could be a resource to folks who were doing difficult and important work, and probably could do it better in some ways.
Well, I think that explains a lot about your passion for this and your heart for this and how you view it. And I would say, I'm sure your father is very proud of what you're doing now, that you decided not to pursue the career you were trained for at Harvard Business School. You just threw. So Phil, we've talked about this, and I mentioned it earlier. There is what I'll call an assault on philanthropy today in much of the literature and several new books from people like Anand Gerhardis, Winners Take All, Rob Reich, who runs the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford, who is arguing that philanthropy is undermining the foundation of the democracy, and David Callahan, who has also critiqued philanthropy, and especially big philanthropy. And then you have, in the donor advised fund area, which community foundations engage in, and there are also commercial gift funds, people like Ray Madoff at Boston College and Alan Cantor questioning the value of donor advised funds. And here I'd always believed that of any work, of any profession, philanthropy was absolutely democratic and absolutely virtuous. What is your view of this? Why is this happening now? And what's your take on this narrative that is so negative toward philanthropy today?
Yeah, I think it's complicated, and it's funny because I have sort of viewed myself, to the extent that I've thought about my role in philanthropy, and certainly other people have described CEP and me over the years as critics of philanthropy, and we've put out a lot of pieces that are critical of the practice of philanthropy, often informed by data and often informed by feedback from folks like nonprofits who we regularly survey about how they feel about their relationships with foundations, and there's lots of room for improvement in that area. But I believe in philanthropy. I mean, I think that the nonprofit sector supported by philanthropy is flawed, just like business is flawed and the government is flawed. But we need each of those three sectors to be better. And so it's funny because for the almost 2 decades that I've been in this work, I've been arguing against this notion that I'm just going to kind of caricature it, that you hear a lot from folks like the faculty at the business school that I went to, which was, philanthropy hasn't accomplished anything, nonprofits are dysfunctional, they should just operate more like business. And I was like, which business? The dry cleaner, Volkswagen, Enron, Apple, which business? It doesn't, not even meaningful, right? And we should approach giving like investing, right? And I argued that that's simplistic, and it overlooks all that is distinctly challenging about the work of nonprofits and philanthropy, which are, after all, often working on the very issues that have defied market or government solutions. And I've argued that nonprofits supported by philanthropy have played a vital role in a lot of things that we take for granted in our lives, like that our kid won't get yellow fever, I mean, we go on the list of diseases, right? That we don't worry about. Or you can talk about the fact that people are free to marry whoever they love, which was the result of the work of many foundations supporting nonprofits. You can talk about access to contraception and reproductive health services in this country and around the world, which without philanthropy would not be what it is, even if it isn't what it needs to be. And so that was kind of the prevailing critique. Now I think we're hearing a different critique, which is a little hard to summarize, but I think is more or less philanthropy is this is Anand's perspective anyway, sort of a ruse to distract from the evil doing with a little do-gooding, and that what philanthropy is really just sustaining and propping up a system that is fundamentally unequal. I disagree with that. There are parts of Anand's book that I agree with. For example, the part that relates to the tendency to sort of deify business, right? But I'm really worried that we not lose sight of the role of community-based organizations, the role of philanthropy. I'm worried about the broad brush with which philanthropy is being painted. If I have to listen one more time to Anand or Rob, who I've known for a long time and who I debated at the Ford Foundation 2 weeks ago, say things like philanthropists like Epstein and the Sacklers, as if they are representative of anyone other than the criminals that in my view they are. That I think that's not helpful at all, and so I'm really worried about it. And I think to your question, where does it come from? I mean, I think there's a deep frustration, obviously, about inequality. There's deep concern about our approach to taxation in this country. I share a lot of those concerns. Maybe we don't want to talk politics here, but I would say I would like to see the wealthy taxed at a higher rate. I would like to see government do more to take care of our most vulnerable citizens. My view is right now government isn't just doing enough to take care of our most vulnerable citizens, they're actually targeting, in many cases, our most vulnerable citizens. And so now, maybe more than ever, to use a cliche I really don't like, we need nonprofits and philanthropy because they're often in the breach, protecting the most vulnerable. So I'm concerned about it, and I think people say, "Oh, Phil, but critique is healthy." Well, of course critique is healthy, but sort of that doesn't mean you have to agree with it all. Critique of critique is also healthy. Debate and discussion is healthy. So we can say, okay, there are parts of Rob's argument and Anand's argument that should make us think hard about the way that we use philanthropy and the power and influence that we have, and to use it to elevate the most vulnerable, not to impose top-down solutions. All of that is good. And let's not sort of cast it all aside and paint it all as corrupt when clearly it isn't.
So for those of us that are hearing about these critiques or reading these books or reading the Chronicle of Philanthropy or picking up articles, the sector itself has been relatively quiet in issuing its critique of those critiques,
right,
or philanthropy's own narrative.
Right.
You don't hear, in particular, the leaders of the largest foundations defending,
right,
to the extent you want to call it a defense or an explanation of what they do and why, and their own introspection about their philanthropy.
Right.
And so for all of us in this room who engage in philanthropy in certain ways and at certain levels, we're not the Gates Foundation in this room. We're not Open Society. How do you think we in the sector here, and those of us that do the work of philanthropy or participate in the work of philanthropy every day, how do we respond? And what do you think we ought to be doing in our communities so that narrative, which I don't agree with, I think there's room for critique, and frankly, I should disclose, the programs I ran at the Gates Foundation are harshly critiqued by these folks. And Phil critiqued them too, which I told him earlier, but you don't need to know. But so I think these things are ripe for critique, but how do we use our voice?
Yeah, so I think that perhaps the most powerful thing we can do is, or that you can do, is use your voice to elevate the work and the stories of the folks you fund, the nonprofits on the ground. So one of the things that I try to do in the book is to tell some of the stories of nonprofit staff and nonprofit leaders. Because, look, I think we have bought into some sort of stereotypes in this country that are really damaging about what it means to work in a nonprofit. You know, and I'm sure you've heard of some of this, sort of like, oh, you couldn't make it in the business world, or you were looking for something a little bit more relaxed, better work-life balance. You know, all of this.
You know, that's not true.
Ridiculous. You know, or you don't really have, you know, analytic skills. And so I, in the first chapter of the book, I just tell the stories of two Massachusetts-based nonprofits that have a lot in common and a lot that's different about them. And just briefly, one of them is called BELL, Building Educated Leaders for Life, and they focus on counteracting what's called summer learning loss, which is the academic backsliding that happens for all students, but more pronounced for low-income students who don't have access to the same kind of resources in the summer. Rigorously evaluated, effective program that they're working to scale. And I talk about Tiffany Guy, who runs that program. And then I tell the story of a guy named Greg Cruteau, who runs an organization called UTech, based in Lowell, Massachusetts, working with the most gang-involved young people to recruit them out of gang life. How do they do that? They do that at hospital bedsides. They do that by visiting these folks in jail. They do it at funerals, because that's when people are open to making a change. Then they get them employed in their mattress recycling facility, or in their wood shop that makes cutting boards that get sold to Whole Foods, or in the cafe that they run right across from the courthouse. They have recidivism of, I believe it is 10% relative to the state average of 50%. And the point I make in telling these two stories is they're very different. One's trying to scale nationally. For the other, the definition of scale is actually to go deeper locally and then to share what works with other organizations. But both of those jobs take everything it takes to run an equivalent sized business and a ton more, right? So Greg Cruteau is negotiating, contracts with the city. He's trying to figure out where the bigger warehouse is going to be for the mattress recycling facility. But he's also a mediator. He's a counselor and a spiritual advisor. He's a mentor, right? And he's trying to retain street workers who get, woken up at 3 in the morning to go to an outbreak of gang violence and keep them working there despite the fact that they can't pay that well. That a lot of their grants are short-term and restricted, and it's hard for him to know what the funding landscape looks like. And I think we got to elevate those stories. They're in every community, and they're doing valuable work that we take for granted. These are the unsung heroes who should be on the covers of magazines, to the extent that there are magazines anymore, rather than the CEOs or other folks that, celebrities that we put on those covers.
Yeah, there's you speak to a sense of philanthropists and humility. It really isn't about the work of the philanthropists, it's about the work of who they fund.
Right.
And is that a necessary component? And just to tie it back, is that sense of humility a function of not providing the narrative about what philanthropy is getting right, because it's not within a humble mindset to do that, and that you're tied to the mission, so focus on the mission, or It's just the knowledge that what is most important is the success of those you invest in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's what's most important is their success, but also, I mean, and I hope I'm responding to your question well. I think it's tied up again with the ways in which giving is different than investing, and the way in which this world is different than the business world. Let me just try to explain what I mean. So, like in well, I'll explain it in two ways. Like the investor analogy, which your mentor Mario Moreno, who I talk about in the book, was one of the sort of fathers of the notion of venture philanthropy. And I think what he realized over the years, and what he allowed me to sort of quote him saying, is this was not as good an analogy, venture capital, as he thought it was going to be. Why? Well, because if you're a venture capitalist, what do you want to have happen? You want the single organization that you're supporting to grow, right? If you're funding Dell, well, like that is kind of what you want, right? You want their growth of that proven program. If you're funding UTech, well, that's not what they're trying to do. You want, but they are trying to share their approach with other communities, because the belief that Greg has is that the community approach to gang-involved youth is going to be community-specific, but there are also probably going to be some shared principles across communities. So he doesn't think the right thing from an impact and results point of view he doesn't think the right thing is for UTech to come to Phoenix, right? So that would never be the case in venture capital. Like, what? You don't want to grow, right? So it's too simplistic an analogy. And another example of that would be strategy for foundations. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people talk about, like, we had XYZ consulting firm in, and they helped us with our strategy, and now this is our strategy, and we're unveiling, and sometimes it's done well, and it really involves, and it is a strategy that many have informed and that many share. But often over the last 20 years, what we've seen is the importation of the definition of strategy that makes sense in a business context, where it's a competitive dynamic, and it's all about, and I did this work, I worked on corporate strategy, and we guarded jealously, what we were doing for our clients. Like, we had a better strategy, and certainly we wouldn't want their competitors to know. Now, if you take that approach as a foundation, and it's our strategy only, it will fail, because no single institution acting alone, can figure out what is best, and because you're already isolated from what's really going on, because you're surrounded by people who are predisposed to tell you what they think you want to hear, and even when you unveil your strategy, they will say, "That's great, so great," and so and it doesn't even matter. And I tell a story about Bill Gates, and I know you worked at the Gates Foundation, that I think, I don't need to, because I think the Gates Foundation has a tremendous amount of good, and I don't need to pick on him, but I tell a story.
My program.
Well, I'm going to tell stories not about your program, where this initiative, which you may have read about, I just talked about it from mostly what had been reported in the media, to encourage poor people in developing countries to raise chickens. And they said they were going to support 100,000 chickens in developing countries in partnership with Heifer International. And Bill Gates wrote a blog post, or at least a blog post appeared on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation website, and it said, "By Bill Gates." And it included this sentence: "If I were poor, that's what I would do. I would raise chickens." And you just wonder, like, where was the communications department? I
can tell you.
Okay. And so the government of Bolivia says no. The Minister of Finance is quoted in the Financial Times saying, "Who does Bill Gates think we are? Some backward people living 500 years ago? We don't want your chickens." And the Guardian ran a headline that said, "Bolivia to Bill Gates, cluck you." and so the point I want to make here is that maybe Bill Gates was right. Sort of like analytically, theoretically, maybe that is the best way out of poverty. For who cares? It doesn't matter if the people you're trying to help, or the people between you and the people you're trying to help, don't also think it's the best thing. And I think that this is a big problem in philanthropy.
So that's what Mario, it was my mentor in philanthropy, and I was hired to do the very thing Phil just talked about. He called it the dance of deceit. The foundation with its brand and its money come to a nonprofit, and as we know, nonprofits struggle for every dollar. And we show up, and in essence, pardon the language, the nonprofit prostitutes themselves before the funder, and the funder corrupts the nonprofit's aspiration. And so there's this disconnect immediately influenced by the power of the money and the power of the brand and the philanthropy. How do you deal with that problem, and how do you address it, and how do you think we should address it?
Right. I mean, so not to sound too like parochial or self-referential, but a big part of what CEP does, it's not the only thing we do, but is to provide feedback to funders that is candid, because it is confidential. The identity of the particular grantees is not known, because we're collecting the data, and then it's comparative, which is really important, because you can't understand like the experience of your grantees without some comparative context. Because getting a grant is in some ways an inherently positive experience, and so folks utilize the high end of an absolute scale, but then comparatively, you're able to realize, oh gee, we're not doing that as well as we had hoped to. So I think part of it is creating the feedback mechanisms, which are going to, I think, have to be through third parties. I mean, no matter how like down to earth you are or believe yourself to be, you cannot sort of ameliorate all the power dynamics, and you will not hear all the truth. So I think a big part of it is about creating those kinds of feedback mechanisms. I think recognizing that if you're forcing a fit, it's probably not a good fit, and that you're less likely to be effective if you are pressuring someone to do something that they don't think is the best thing for them. Trying to
But
change.
you have to know as a philanthropist that you bring that to the table, that power and influence to the table, so you have to be disciplined to know that you brought that power differential there, right?
Exactly, and I also think that obviously there's been a lot of talk in this field, if you want to call it that, about long-term general operating support. Like we know from our research, and people are like, well, we knew that anyway, Phil, but we do know from our research that grantees experience, in terms of how they experience the impact of foundation grants, is more positive. It's correlative, I can't say it's causal, but when they are receiving long-term, significant general support. Well, of course it is, because it's a kind of flexibility that is so important. That does shift the power dynamic too, I think. And it relates to all of these conversations about overhead as well, and about the notion that, why would you come into a relationship with a nonprofit and say, well, we don't actually, well, let me say, I'm not an absolutist on this. It's not like it never makes sense to provide a project restricted grant. But when there is significant overlap between the organization's goals and your goals, then their success is your success. And it makes sense to fund in a way that gives them the strength and flexibility to be successful. And even if you are going to provide restricted grants, programs only exist within organizations, and so organizations need to be strong. And so I think if funders can approach funding in that way, and recognize that if fundamentally you're so concerned about how the money is being allocated, because you have that level of distrust in the leadership of the organization, you shouldn't be funding them in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's also how you start that relationship. And I'm often asked, just tell me what you want me to tell you so I can get the grant.
Right.
What do you need to hear?
Right.
And I've learned over the years not to let that happen, to kind of proactively stop it. And so I start the conversation when somebody tells me they're a nonprofit,
Right.
before the question gets asked, what is your aspiration?
Right.
What do you want to do with your nonprofit?
Right.
And have them articulate first where they want to go, so I'm not in a position to tell them what I want them to do.
Right. Right.
So we have to be intentional about how we start those relationships, I think.
I
And I
agree.
think that's what you're saying.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let me go back to strategy for a minute.
Yeah.
And I don't think I heard you say you oppose strategy. It's,
On the contrary.
but you know the evils of strategy too.
I'm a big believer in strategy if we define strategy as, a sort of a logic about hypotheses that these activities are likely to lead to these outcomes. And if we recognize that I'm a huge proponent of strategy in philanthropy. What I'm arguing is that strategy plays out in the philanthropic context different than it does in a business context. And that strategy is actually not a business concept. Strategy has its roots in the Greek word for army. So strategy is crucial. It has to be shared, and then the other thing about it is it has to be iterative because of the level of complexity and interdependence of so many of these issues that are being worked on. So it cannot be fixed because it's unlikely that you'll get it right the first time. So that's what I think about strategy.
So how about strategy or being strategic versus being opportunistic? I know grant makers who are purely opportunistic. They say, we don't have a strategy. We look for the opportunities we want to get behind. And we're nimble and flexible, and we're not bound by some long-term 5-year, 10-year strategy that causes us to miss great funding opportunities. What do you think of that?
I don't know, I find that confusing because I think, first we have to back up and say, what are the goals? Right? Are we clear on the goals? And then, what is the filter by which we're deciding what we would fund that would be likely to contribute to the achievement of those goals? And so I guess I feel that one can be opportunistic and strategic simultaneously. What do I mean by that, or can I give a good example? And Kim thinks we should open it up soon, by the way. But,
I know.
but
I have another question, and then we will.
okay, all right. Just wanted to get that out there. But so
I was very opportunistic.
it was opportunistic. Think about the work on. I read about this in the book. The work on marriage equality, and a consortium of funders pooled 120 something, maybe 50 something $million. I forget. And they're supporting efforts to try to change public perception of gay marriage, right? And they believe that the way to do that is to be all about equality and fairness, and it's not right that heterosexual married couples get these benefits, but gay and lesbian couples don't. And that didn't work. It didn't get through to people, right? So then they commissioned some research, and there's an opportunity that emerges. The opportunity is the realization that there is a different message that is more about love, and that focuses, story told in a different way, focuses more on people like grandparents or parents of gay and lesbian people and their aspirations they have for their children and grandchildren. That resonates. So there's the opportunity, so you take that opportunity. It's highly strategic. So I guess I kind of reject the premise that there's a tension. You have to know where you're going. You have to have some sense of how you think you're going to get there. And you have to be open to learning all the time that actually there's a better way or a different thing that emerges or the context changes. And so I'm not a big believer in 3 or 5 year strategic plans, because imagine if you were a funder focused on immigration and you finished your 3-year strategic plan in October 2016, right? And then you said, oh, we've got a plan, we're gonna just stick to it, right? But more of a strategic framework that you iterate as the context changes.
So last question, and then we'll open it up, and it has to do with some a considerable amount of time you spend in the book about impact and assessment and how you measure the effectiveness of your philanthropy. And that has, over the years, been prone to that business school model of
Right.
seeking predictability,
Right.
having really clear metrics, being very quant-oriented. And what do you think of that, and how should we as philanthropists think about how we measure our impact? And what are the dimensions you think we ought to look at?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the really sort of simple truth that seems to somehow elude people is fundamental to all of this, which is that in business, you can finally assess very, very different companies in very different industries doing different things by one metric that is most important, as profit. And that in the nonprofit world, there is no analog to profit, and there never will be. And that, does that make measurement less important? No, it makes it more important, right? But it has to be tailored to the particular goals of the organization, and we have to be nuanced about this. So we have to recognize that for Bell, if they were scaling a program focused on summer learning loss, they had a moral obligation, in my view, to make sure in a very rigorous way that it worked, that they compared the young people who had access to the program to similar young people who didn't, and they compared those results, because it would be irresponsible to scale, as for example, DARE or Scared Straight did, a program that didn't work. So that's the right move for them. For UTech, which was asked by some funders to do randomized control trials, but has the capacity, unlike Bell, to work with every single young person in their target population. What would doing a randomized control trial have meant? It would have meant risking the lives of people that they would otherwise help. They said, no, that's not the right thing, we're not gonna do it. They're very data driven. They're constantly looking at recidivism rates. They have a bunch of other metrics that they're monitoring all the time. And there's this tendency to, it's all dependent. If you're trying to change life outcomes for young people, then you have to look at their life outcomes. If you're running a children's museum, there shouldn't be any expectation that when I took my daughters to the children's museum, their lives were going to be different when they were 30 as a result. But that doesn't mean the children's museum shouldn't measure stuff. They should. Like, for example, they might want to get some feedback on the experience from people who visited through surveys, and whether they liked it or not, and what could be better. They might want to look at the demographic characteristics of the people visiting the museum and make sure they weren't just attracting affluent people, and they might want to do outreach to other communities if they were, and so on. So we can be, this thing that drives me crazy is you read, like every day, it seems like, a different article in like Forbes, usually, or somewhere like that. The business types are applying their MBA, smarts to measurement in the nonprofit sector. You don't learn anything in an MBA program about how to measure something like Bell. That's not what you learn. That's a whole different set of skills. Running a randomized control trial. So this has been far oversimplified, and we have to embrace the complexity. And then as funders, and then I'll stop, and I know we want to open it up, and now I'm the reason we're not. As funders, we have to be willing, if we want that information, to fund nonprofits, support them to get that information, and we have to be in two-way dialogue with them about what is useful to them, not just what is useful to us or to our boards.
Awesome. Okay. I told you at the beginning, do not be shy. Questions? Yes, sir.
First of all, I feel it's great to be with you again this afternoon. Didn't realize I was going to come halfway across the country to see you.
Hey, do you mind telling people why you're here? Because it's really special what you're doing.
Sure, it just happened to be serendipitous that it coincided with Phil's book talk. So, Dwayne Marshall, I'm here from the Community Foundation of Greater Chattanooga. And I've been in Arizona for the last 2 days for a training co-sponsored by CF Leads, as well as another organization that's near and dear to me in the community, that's CFON, Community Foundation Opportunity Network. And they had a training called the Introduction to Community Leadership with different community foundations from across the country, leaning into how we can be more effective in investing in community leadership. So again, I want to thank you, Steve, for hosting us.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure, which actually is a perfect segue to my question. Phil, we give a lot of conversation, appropriately so, to how funders can be more effective in their grant making and doing that right. I'd love to hear what you're seeing across the country in terms of effective trends of how funders can better invest in people, both on the citizen leadership side of things, but also governance within their institutions to ensure that we have a stronger social sector going forward.
That's great. And I was so surprised to get an email from Dwayne this morning, who I've known for years, saying, I'll see you at your book talk. I was like, what? So anyway, great to see you. And you know, I think that funders, that are really effective, I think, recognize that they've got support. The people who work in nonprofits, and they have to also support the governance of those organizations. I think I'll answer your question this way, which is to say, I think there's a long, long way to go. I am saddened to spend time at organizations that are highly effective, and I'm talking about usually smaller community-based organizations, that are paying only half of medical, no retirement contribution. I wrote in the Chronicle a few months ago about an organization called Counterpulse, $1.2 million budget in the Tenderloin area, San Francisco, a great arts organization. Everybody respects Counterpulse. Many of their staff go on to places like MoMA if they don't go to Facebook or Google. And I asked Julie Phelps, the executive director, well, who's the longest tenured staff member? And she said, oh, me, of course. Been there a number of years. And I said, okay, can I ask at your staff, we're at staff meeting. I said, who's next? Longest tenured, out of whatever it was, 9 people, 2 years, right? Nobody. So I guess I think the biggest opportunity, we can talk about coaching, we can talk about leadership development, but I think we got to talk about how do we allow nonprofits to pay a living wage so that people can have careers in this work. And I think this is a little bit uncomfortable maybe to look at, but how do we feel if we work at a foundation about the difference between the approach to compensation and benefits at our foundation and the organizations that we're supporting, particularly those organizations that we see as key or vital to our work. And it's tough, and so that you don't just think I'm only challenging or criticizing you, I would also say, and maybe this is naive, and I actually, one of my board members, well, Tiffany from Bell, told me, you are naive, Phil, to think that this could happen. But I think nonprofit leaders have to speak up, and because I've been, in conversation with folks who are supported by foundations whose staff I know very well, who I think would be responsive to, but they're afraid to. They're afraid because then they would have to tell the foundation how significant the turnover really is, and how significant the challenges really are. Somewhere, somehow, we got to break through and have those conversations. That may not be exactly what, I know less about all the other stuff in terms of the leadership and coaching and different programs. I think there are some good ones. I think Haas Jr. has done some really good stuff in that area. But I'd love to see more attention to be paid to that issue. And the Chronicle actually did a really good piece on this just a couple weeks ago. You didn't see it.
Thank you.
Other questions? I know you have. Yes, Chip?
Hi, Chip.
Good afternoon, I'm Chip Ellsberg. I used to be a foundation executive, and now I'm working with 501c3 organizations. You talked about trust. This is not meant to be a softball question. And I want to disclose that the foundation for which I work had 2 grantee perception reports completed. Phil reported on both occasions to the board, and in the second, we had customized questions on trust. So here's the headline, and indulge me just for a minute. Can trust be a tangible philanthropic asset? We live at a particular time where trust is eroding in ways I've never seen in my adult life. So what I shared with Dwayne a few minutes ago before we got started, a current Pew survey shows that 81% of people surveyed think that members of Congress are unethical. But the same population respondents thinks that 69% of our religious leaders are unethical, and 61% of police officers are unethical. That's the status of trust in society today. That's a current snapshot. If you believe, as I do, that trust and trusting is something that we individually do, it's something we make, we create, we build, we maintain, we sustain with our promises, our commitments, and our personal and professional integrity. As CEOs of foundations and the Center for Effective Philanthropy, what role, if any, does philanthropy have to play in trust building, both between funders, foundations, donors, and grantees, and writ large to help civil society, which is eroded tremendously by the lack of trust?
That's a wonderful and important question, and obviously I don't have all the answers, but I should have said that right at the beginning. You came looking for all the answers, you came to the wrong place. I think that there is my hope right now is all about at the community level what's happening, because you got to look for hope somewhere, and it's hard to find. And I think that there are opportunities, some of which I've seen, foundations and foundation leaders really take advantage of, to bring people together across difference in ways that are really powerful. And I think everybody's got to be looking for those opportunities, whether it be the series of sort of simultaneous across the city of Chicago conversations that the Chicago Community Trust sponsored and hosted to get citizens talking to each other about what the most pressing issues are. Maybe seems like a little thing, but all kinds of relationships established that wouldn't have otherwise been established, whether it be in your approach to grant making, emphasizing trust, and so much follows from that about how you approach the proposal process, reporting, your own leadership and accountability to others on your staff and to people in your community. I mean, there's so many questions we can ask ourselves about the things we do. I think you have to make yourself a little bit vulnerable in that process. And a lot of leaders have a hard time doing that. It means being open about what isn't going well. That's how you build trust and credibility, in my view, is to be open about what mistakes you made. It means saying you're sorry when you screw something up, and not just firing someone else and blaming them for it. There's so many different components of this, and Chip, I think we should maybe have a 2-hour dinner and have this conversation. But I guess the other thing I would say is just I do believe that nonprofits are one of the few places where people come together just to get stuff done and don't really care about where the other people came from or what their politics are. And so, I did a lot of, I spent a lot of time with nonprofits when I was working on the book, and I didn't spend nearly enough time. And I'm trying to spend more time, just in different communities. And so you go to a place like this community health center in Houston that I write about, which is a
$600,000 budget, and these places are everywhere. You know this, right? Because you're funding many of them. But it's the Epiphany Community Health Outreach Services on the campus of a church in a neighborhood with a lot of need, and it's a place where people go when they are desperate for help. The staff there of 9, 2 of whom first encountered the place when they were clients, helps sign folks up for programs they didn't know they were eligible for, leads people to the food pantry to make sure that they have food to eat, calls the domestic violence shelter if they need to, and makes a referral and makes sure that someone gets connected to a place where they can be safe with their children. And you hang out there, and you have people of every race. You have people. You've got young Latinx couple next to a older white guy who's a vet, and they're all there because they need help. And then you've got volunteers like this guy I met who just turned 80. I saw the picture on Twitter of the birthday celebration the staff and clients had for this 80-year-old retired lawyer, white guy named Bob Bennett, who is there almost every day, and he runs the vision screening that they do. Harvey hit, and everybody showed up there. And when Bob told me about the response to the hurricane, he was so proud of that organization and of the 24-year-old staff members that he's become friends with, right? And that's what restores your hope that we can have relationships and across a lot of difference, anchored in our goodness.
Yeah. And you think about why that organization is successful, because there is trust.
Absolutely.
And then when you think about nonprofits and the cracks in the community where they're working, where government doesn't know how to go.
Right.
And where they know how to go, and they're successful because they establish trust with those they serve in that community. Otherwise, it's not the grants or lack thereof that will put them out of business. So it's the fact that they couldn't establish trust in their community. So if that is the type of organization that's the recipient of a grant, what does it say about us that is working with an organization that has the ability and the capacity to build that trust in their communities? They've got to be able to build that trust with us and we with them. And you talk about this in your chapter 5 about essential partners and about relationships, and I'll take it a step further to a word that we use around here in the Community Foundation about what's the level of intimacy that we can establish with the donors we work with and their charitable goals, and then the organizations that we fund. And so it's a thread that runs through all of it, don't you think?
Yeah.
And that as philanthropists, how often, I don't remember until Chip raised the question, how often we, when we're together, talk about forming those trusting relationships with those we fund.
Yeah, and if I can say, just to make this really particular, because I think there's an analog here that's broader. When I wrote about the time I spent at ECHOS, which is the acronym in Houston, I described this scene where basically people line up there, sometimes at 5:36 in the morning, and they open I think at 8. But then they realized that people were, it's not usually that cold in Houston, but sometimes it gets chilly. Now they have one person come in and open up at 7, just a waiting area, so at least people can have a more comfortable place to wait. And I watched sort of what happens when the executive director goes in and there's this crowd of people, and she's talking, someone's translating it to Spanish, someone else is handing out treats, like candy to the kids at 8 in the morning. And she says, have any of you had the experience of coming here before, only to realize that you didn't have the right documents after you'd waited hours, and then you had to go back? And this one guy raises his hand, young guy, and he goes, yeah, I did, but it was my fault. I should have known to bring the right stuff. And Kathy, the ED, she goes, no, it was our fault. And he goes, no, it really was my fault. And she goes, no, really it was our fault. And we changed our process now, and we're gonna go and have a quick conversation with each of you before anyone waits anymore, to make sure you have the right documents, and then we'll take people in order. And he goes, really, it was my fault. And she goes, no, it was mine. And I think that and what she was doing was building trust. And she did that by showing her own vulnerability and saying, like, we didn't do this well, and we're trying to do better. And I think there's an analog there, for funders and grantees too.
Yeah, great point. Other questions? Yes?
Hi, my whole career has been in fundraising on the nonprofit side, and I've been with Regional here, Dignity Health, and then I went to Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska for 5 years. Now I'm with a company that's privately funded, so we are not for-profit. I make sure I say we're not for-profit, it's Equality Health. Steve, I think you know our CEO, Hugh Lytle, and I'm running the nonprofit arm of that. So when you started the conversation, Phil, when you opened up, you said about, you got the venture capital over here, we're private equity funded.
Yeah.
So we are not for-profit, we owe a lot of people some money as we roll out. What advice would you have, because it's very innovative that Hugh has decided to create the 501c3. I'm very focused on community. What Equality Health does is amazing, but I'm the focus of the community at large, focusing on Hispanic and healthcare disparities. What advice would you have for someone like me who's only known the whole world of a Dignity Health or Boys Town?
So can you be more specific? What advice in what way? In terms of how do you navigate the two kind of worlds that you're between?
Yes, because you talked about, right when you opened, I thought, here's the guy saying what we're at the word like scale and all this stuff on the equality side,
Right.
and I'm trying to embed myself in the community here in Phoenix where we started.
Right.
So we're looking at Southern California, Texas. There's that venture capital mentality, and there are some foundations that fund this innovative model. But again, someone like myself who only knows the nonprofit mentality, mission-driven, prayer openings, we don't do any of that in a business-driven community.
And who do you report to?
I report directly to the CEO.
Yeah.
So if I can pick it, so it's that tension, particularly in corporate philanthropy, where you have a nonprofit arm, a
Right.
community-based arm,
Right.
or corporate social responsibility, and the business and the core work of the company,
Right.
and how you manage where those running the nonprofit work or the corporate social responsibility work are running into a different value system
Yeah.
of which you spoke about, while they're trying to engage with the community and my word, maybe seek different qualitative indicators of their performance than what the company is suggesting.
Right. No, I think it's very difficult, and I think that not to be too simplistic about it, but I think the best thing you can do is for whoever the key people are whose support you need in order to be effective. So, but it's the CEO, and maybe there are others, is to find ways to get them close to the ground to see what it's like. And I mean, the problem is that, the problems are exacerbated by the fact that I think many in the nonprofit sector, for reasons I understand, have essentially adopted, this sort of market-based business jargon. And I feel like I'm bilingual, like I speak business, but I can speak nonprofit. But increasingly, there's it's harder to get people because they know what donors are looking for. But I think for the relationship really to work, there has to be an openness to learning on both sides, and to say, and so, I often tell people that I get a lot of calls from folks and have conversations with people who are new to philanthropy, and they didn't expect to have all the money that they have. And the tendency is to just want to apply whatever worked in the business world. So like the most egregious, maybe, and absurd, I think, recent example of this from a few years ago was Sean Parker's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which was one of the most infuriating things I've ever read, in which he basically said, he was the guy who Justin Timberlake played in the movie about Facebook. He's actually like a real guy who's, not quite as handsome as Justin Timberlake, but anyway, he probably doesn't
really
singer
like
either.
him.
But he said, what we need is hacker philanthropy, right? And he proceeded to just like say nothing good has ever happened in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, but now I'm here and I'm going to approach it the way I approached, my career. And there's this weird dynamic in our sector where everyone's like, oh, did you read Sean Parker's article? The guy hadn't even done any philanthropy yet, and so I think when folks tell me, well, Phil, I've had a lot of good meetings with other donors, and I met with this consultant and that consultant and this expert, and and I always say, like, have you spent much time at nonprofits, or talked to the staff, or have you talked to the people whose lives you're trying to improve, the people you're trying to help, who are, after all, the best experts on their own lives? And so I think if you can just find ways to be that bridge, it's still going to be hard, and it's going to take time. That's the best advice I can give you, which is probably not that great.
But I'll just, if I could tack on to that, and we'll see, it will take some time. You all may have heard the recent announcement by the National Business Roundtable, an organization that represents the CEOs of the largest companies in the country. And they restated the purpose of a corporation from focusing on shareholder value to, in a nutshell, stakeholder. That we have to be interested in and care about and invest in the communities where we operate. And so it was a wonderful statement, I think a beautiful statement. Now I could be really cynical about this. Why now, why today?
Right.
With such enormous inequality in the US and the fear of what will happen with the next recession, and will we come and burn your houses down? So we better start talking about community. That's a cynical view that I've heard. And I think there's some merit to that fear given our current divisiveness in our culture. But if they really mean it, and they act on it, then the dissonance that you feel may, hopefully, optimistically, shift for you, where what you do is core to what that corporation is and what they believe, and the differences are smoothed out, and that the company sees profit from some new metrics that they learn from you, and that would be hopeful if that could happen.
It's already happened.
Then great, then I won't be cynical. Other questions? I think we have time. Kim, one more? Okay, one more question. Who has the last question? Somebody has got to have the last question. There we go. Thank you.
Hi Phil, welcome to Arizona. My name is David Martinez from Vitalist Health Foundation. Steve, you opened it mentioning all of the transformation that's happening in philanthropy with the pushback and whatnot, and one person that is in that is Edgar Villanueva, who really uses race, power, and privilege. So I'm wondering how you note that in your book, if you do at all, in your own power and privilege from your race or your background, and how that influences your perspective in the book. And a follow-up to that is, what advice would you give to a younger Latino LGBTQ person that's new into philanthropy?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
Asking for a friend, right?
Yeah. So, first of all, before getting to the substance of your question, one of the people often talk about Edgar's book in the same breath as Rob and Anand's book. But one of the big differences between Edgar's book and Rob and Anand's book is Edgar's book actually mentions nonprofits. Like, he actually, right, and I know him a little bit, because actually he works at the Shaw Foundation, which used to be in our building, although he works out of New York, I think. But I think that, you know, I think there's a lot of messages in his book about sort of getting proximate, about building relationships with the folks whose lives you seek to help, about having humility, about giving up power, that are consistent with what I try to write about in the book. And then there are some things that I think Edgar and I would have like a spirited, you know, debate about. I think with respect to, I mean, I would just say I'm very aware, and we can talk more about this, of my own privilege on many different dimensions. And one of the things I try to do is you know, use it where I can, you know, for positive change. And the biggest area of frustration for me right now is with respect to the lack of diversity on foundation boards. And I'm talking about racial diversity, but I'm also talking about diversity of experience. Like, why? I've got no problem with lawyers and business folks on foundation boards. I think they bring something. But they don't need to be all lawyers and business folks. And what about people whose lives connect in some way to the programmatic work, or might have been affected by work similar to what the foundation funds? What about people who have experience working on the front lines of nonprofits? Why are so few foundation boardrooms sort of populated by folks like that? I think it's a huge problem. Your question's a huge one that I can't possibly do justice to in a short period of time. In terms of advice for you, you know, this may just be really generic, but I really believe in this for folks who are earlier in their career, is don't just network to network, find the people, you know, who believe in you, who might not be people at your current place of work, right, but who you can form those relationships with, and who you can call and talk to about your career choices, and try to have that be a diverse group, including, you know, people who might face similar obstacles to you, and others who might not, and others who face different ones.
I think that's a great note to end on, because that's of course what we do at Arizona Grantmakers Forum, is provide a place for you to make those connections and find those mentors. And join me in thanking Steve and Phil today.